It was supposed to be a celebration, a small dinner for two, the kind that carries the weight of decades, shared laughter, quiet promises, the silent language two people learn after years of being together. The table was dressed carefully, almost ritualistically. White tablecloth, a vase with wilted lilies she had chosen from the garden, two plates facing each other like mirrors of a life once perfectly aligned. Candlelight flickered between them, soft and uncertain. It moved across his face, across the years that had settled around his eyes, across the wedding band that had dulled with time. There was warmth in the room, the kind that comes from routine, not passion. And yet somewhere beneath that stillness, something fragile trembled. He smiled, the way he always did when words felt unnecessary, and she smiled back, but her hand stayed on her lap. She noticed how the shadows from the flames leaned toward him, as if even the light knew where it wanted to stay. Outside, the wind brushed softly against the curtains. The night was kind, gentle, forgiving, but inside, something was shifting quietly, like the slow crack of old glass. She could feel it. The faint distance between them wasn't new. It had grown in small, invisible ways. Through missed glances, unfinished conversations, laughter that ended too soon. She remembered when their silences used to be comforting. Now they were full of questions she didn't know how to ask. How does love sound after it's stopped echoing? When does familiarity become absence? The music playing in the background, an old record they once danced to, suddenly felt like a memory performing for an audience that no longer believed in the story. The scent of jasmine from her perfume mingled with the faint bitterness of wine. Everything looked beautiful, but beauty, she thought, can sometimes be the softest disguise for ache. She watched him raise his glass. The candlelight trembled again, and for a moment, it looked like it might go out. She wondered if that was how love fades, not with a storm, but with a slow, quiet flicker that no one notices until the room goes dark. He began to speak. Something about how quickly time had passed, how grateful he was for the years they'd shared. But his voice sounded rehearsed, like a song played too often. She heard the words, but not the meaning. And in that moment she realized it wasn't his words she missed. It was the pauses between them, the ones that once felt like home. Her eyes drifted to the shelf behind him, the photo album they hadn't opened in years. Dust had gathered along its edges. Inside those pages, they were still laughing, still holding hands, still believing that love could be enough to silence every ghost. She didn't know why her chest felt tight. Maybe it was the candlelight, or maybe it was memory, the kind that sneaks up gently but leaves a mark. She looked at him again and saw not the man he was, but the years between them, the mistakes, the forgivenesses, the things they never said aloud. It was an ordinary night, really. Just dinner, just two people, just the quiet hum of a shared life. And yet, beneath it all, there was a question she could no longer ignore. How much of love survives when memory refuses to fade? The answer didn't come, only the soft flutter of the candle, the sound of silverware on porcelain, and the unspoken truth resting between them, trembling, like light unsure of its place in the dark. There was a time when everything felt lighter. Before the silences, before the questions, before the quiet weight of what they'd both stopped saying. Back then, love didn't need explanation. It simply lived in the small things. She still remembers the sound of his laughter, the kind that came from the belly, unguarded and real. It used to echo across open fields, down narrow streets where their dreams still felt too big for the world they lived in. He was the kind of man who made everything feel possible. When he looked at her, it felt like the future was something they could build out of sunlight and bare hands. They met in the ordinary way, two lives brushing together in the quiet accident of timing. A bookstore, a spilled cup of coffee, a clumsy apology that turned into a smile that lasted too long. It wasn't cinematic, not at first. It was just human, two people trying to find something they didn't know they were missing. In those early years, laughter was their language. They didn't have much. An old car that stalled in the rain, an apartment that smelled faintly of damp books and jasmine tea. But they had each other, and that was enough. Every evening, she'd cook by the window and he'd hum old songs behind her. Sometimes he'd wrap his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder, and they'd sway gently, like time itself had forgotten them. It was in moments like those that she believed love could protect them from everything. From the storms outside, from the ghosts of who they were before they met. But even love, she would later learn, carries shadows. The first time she heard her name, it was almost a joke. A friend mentioning someone from his past, the kind of story that slips out casually. He laughed when he said it, that familiar, careless laugh. But she noticed the way his eyes changed for just a second, as if a door had opened somewhere inside him. At first, she thought nothing of it. Everyone has a past, she told herself, but over time the name began to echo. In the songs he still played on the old radio, in the silence that followed certain questions, in the way he avoided the towns they used to visit. She told herself it didn't matter, that he had chosen her, that what came before was nothing compared to what they had now. And yet, sometimes when he looked out the window too long, she wondered who he was remembering. The years moved gently, as years often do. Children came, responsibilities grew, laughter softened into comfort, and comfort into habit. She built her life around the rhythm of ordinary things, packed lunches, birthday candles, Sunday laundry. And though she smiled, there was a small part of her that always listened for the echo of that name. One evening, while cleaning the attic, she found it, the box. Old wooden, worn smooth at the edges. It wasn't hers. Inside were letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. She didn't open them, not then. She told herself they were from another life, one that didn't belong to her. She tucked the box away, behind blankets and dust and years, as if hiding it could also hide the unease that had begun to grow inside her. But sometimes, when the nights were too quiet, she'd think about it. The letters, the woman, the part of him she would never fully know. And though she loved him deeply, more than she could explain, that love carried a tremor, faint but constant, like a heartbeat beneath glass. Still, there were mornings when everything felt simple again. The smell of coffee, the warmth of his hand on hers, the laughter of children running down the hall. Those moments reminded her why she stayed, because love, even when uncertain, was still love. Because sometimes, pretending not to notice was easier than confronting what might break you. She told herself that every marriage had ghosts. Hers just happened to have a name, and so she went on, cooking, laughing, remembering, forgetting, trying to convince her heart that the days when laughter was enough weren't gone. Just quieter now. The night returned like a quiet storm, the kind that doesn't rage but lingers. The house smelled of candle wax and roses. The table was dressed with care. Her best china, the wine they saved for special days. The small vase holding lilies he once said were her favorite. It was their anniversary. 30 years. She had ironed his shirt that morning, pressed her dress, and even lit the same brand of candles they'd used the night he proposed. Everything was as it should be, except the way his eyes didn't quite meet hers. He smiled, polite, distracted. The kind of smile you wear when your mind is elsewhere. They talked about the weather, the children, the new neighbors down the street. Words filled the air like soft dust, light, meaningless, drifting. And yet, beneath it all, she felt something tightening. A quiet distance, the kind you can't measure, but you know it's there, stretching thin between two hearts that used to move as one. The meal was beautiful. Her laughter, practiced. His glances, brief. And then it happened. His phone buzzed. A soft vibration against the wooden table. He reached for it quickly, too quickly. And in that fleeting motion, the screen lit up. And she saw it. A name. Familiar, distant, once buried in the attic of memory. For a moment, the air around her froze. The sound of the ticking clock grew louder, sharper. Her fingers tightened around her glass, the reflection of the candlelight trembling in the wine. He looked up, unaware that she'd seen. And in that second, she knew. It wasn't betrayal she felt. It was recognition. The past had found its way back, quiet and uninvited. They ate in silence after that. The kind of silence that doesn't just fill a room. It presses against your skin. Every clink of a fork, every shallow breath became a sound she could feel in her bones. When he finally spoke, it was soft. Too soft. He said her name, the one that had lived like a ghost between them all these years. She reached out after her husband passed. He didn't look up when he said it. He didn't need to. Her chest tightened, but her voice stayed calm. Decades of practiced grace. She didn't shout, didn't cry, just asked in a tone barely above a whisper, "Why her?" He paused, not out of guilt, but out of the weight of too many memories trying to find the right place to rest. "She wanted closure," he said quietly. "I didn't want to hurt you." And there it was. Not a confession, not an affair, just the ache of unfinished stories. The kind that never truly end, only fade until someone dares to remember them again. She nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the flickering candle between them. The flame bent slightly, dancing in the quiet draft of their unspoken truths. He reached for her hand, but she didn't move. Not out of anger, but because she didn't know what forgiveness looked like anymore. In that stillness, she saw everything. Not the years of marriage, not the birthdays, not the laughter, but the invisible thread that had always connected them to something unfinished. She wanted to hate him. But all she could feel was exhaustion, the kind that comes not from betrayal, but from carrying the weight of someone else's history for too long. She thought of the box in the attic, the letters, the ribbon, the dust. She had left them untouched all these years, but now they called to her again, like the voice of something she had tried too hard to forget. The room stayed still, the candle burned lower, and somewhere between them, the silence spoke, not with words, but with the quiet truth that love, no matter how long it lasts, is never free from the echoes of what came before. When she rose from the table, she didn't say a word. He didn't stop her, and as she walked down the hallway, past the photos of their life together, she realized something that broke her more than any confession could. He hadn't chosen her again tonight. He had simply remembered someone else. The house was quiet that night, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, as if even the walls are holding their breath. She couldn't sleep. The bed felt too large, too cold, the air too still. Outside, the wind moved through the trees with a low hum, the same sound that once lulled her to peace. But not tonight. Her eyes wandered to the ceiling, tracing the familiar cracks like old roads, paths that had led her through years of laughter, fights, forgiveness, and the kind of love that survives not because it's perfect, but because it refuses to die. But now, even that love felt distant, thin. And then she remembered the box. It had been years since she last thought of it. Tucked away in the attic, beneath old linens and forgotten seasons, a simple wooden box tied with a faded ribbon. She had found it long ago, before the children left home, before the silver began to thread through his hair. She had known what it was then, even without opening it. The handwriting, the faint scent of cologne, the way her heart had trembled just seeing it. That night, her body moved before her mind could protest. Barefoot, she walked down the hallway, her steps soundless against the old floorboards. The attic door creaked softly, the air carrying the smell of dust and time. The box sat where she'd left it, patient, untouched, as if waiting for her to be ready. She carried it down to the living room, setting it gently on the table where the candle still flickered low. For a moment, she just stared at it. Her hands hovered above the ribbon, trembling. Every second felt like a question she had avoided for half her life. And then, she untied it. Inside, the letters lay neatly folded. Yellowed edges, ink fading with age. Each one began the same way. Each one spoke of a time before her. The words were tender, young, filled with the certainty only youth can carry. She read the first one slowly, letting the sentences move through her like ghosts. There was laughter in the words, dreams, promises, and beneath them all, a man she once knew, her husband, but not yet hers. Tears didn't come. Not right away. Instead, what filled her was something quieter. Recognition. This was the version of him she had never met. The one who wrote with passion, who dreamed freely, who hadn't yet learned the language of restraint that marriage sometimes teaches. She placed the letter down, then another and another. Each one revealed not betrayal, but humanity, the kind of love that exists before life teaches you how fragile it all is. At some point, she found herself smiling, not out of joy, but out of a strange, aching tenderness. Because now she understood. He hadn't hidden these letters out of shame. He had kept them out of fear. Fear that remembering too much would somehow take away from what they had built. And maybe she was the same. Maybe she had feared them too, because if she read them, she'd have to accept that love doesn't always begin and end neatly. Sometimes it overlaps, one love fading into another, leaving traces behind like fingerprints on glass. She leaned back, closing her eyes. The candlelight flickered against the walls, soft and golden, and in that glow, she saw the two of them, not as enemies of the past and present, but as pieces of one long story. A story that began before her and somehow found its way to her anyway. When she opened her eyes again, dawn was beginning to stretch across the window. The sky was pale blue, brushed with the gentlest gold. She picked up one letter, the one that had felt the heaviest, and walked out to the balcony. The morning air was cool, clean. She unfolded the paper one last time, read the words, and whispered them into the wind. Then, she let it go. The letter fluttered for a moment, weightless, before catching a breeze and drifting upward, a fragile white leaf against the light of morning. She watched until it vanished into the horizon. No tears came. Just a deep breath, and in that breath, something uncoiled inside her. Not forgiveness, not yet, but release. Because love, she realized, isn't about who we hold on to. It's about learning when to let go, gently, quietly, without bitterness. She went back inside, closing the door softly behind her. The box still sat on the table, its contents scattered, the ribbon lying loose beside it. She didn't pack it away this time. She just left it open, letting the morning light fall over the letters. And for the first time in years, the house didn't feel haunted by memory. It felt human, lived in, real. That night, she didn't dream of loss. She dreamed of wind and light, and a letter carried far, far away. The days that came after were quieter, not the kind of quiet that hurts, but the kind that heals. For the first time in years, she moved through her home without feeling like every corner carried a secret. The air seemed lighter, the rooms somehow softer, as if something unseen had finally exhaled. She didn't mention the letters to him. Not yet. Maybe she never would. It wasn't secrecy. It was peace. Some truths didn't need to be spoken to be understood. They simply existed, gently, between two people who had lived enough to know that love wasn't about perfect honesty, but about chosen kindness. One afternoon, she found him in the garden, trimming the old rose bushes that refused to bloom. He looked up when she came out, his hands dusty, his face shaded by the brim of his hat. He smiled. That small, familiar smile that had once made her heart race, now simply made her feel safe. "Too early to prune them," she said softly. He chuckled. "You always say that." She watched him for a while, her eyes tracing the curve of his shoulders, the way he leaned into his work. Gentle, careful, as if tending to something fragile. It struck her how much they had both changed, how much love had changed. Once love was letters and longing. Now it was quiet mornings, coffee brewed just right, the comfort of someone who remembered how you took your tea. Love had become less of a fire and more of a slow, steady flame, something that didn't burn, but warmed. That evening, they ate dinner by the window. Outside, the first stars blinked through the dusk. He spoke about small things, the neighbor's new dog, the weather, the sound the fridge had started making again. She listened, smiling faintly, but her thoughts drifted. For years, she had measured love by grand gestures. anniversaries, apologies, the moments that took her breath away. Now she realized that love, real love, was often quiet, almost invisible. It lived in the pauses, in the everyday grace of staying when it would have been easier to go. After dinner, he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. It was a simple touch, warm, unhurried. But something in her stilled. His eyes met hers, and for the briefest moment she thought he knew. About the letters, about the night she sat with ghosts and came out the other side. Maybe he did, or maybe he just sensed the shift, the quiet forgiveness that had settled in her like sunlight through a window. He didn't say anything, and neither did she. They didn't need to. Later that night, as they sat together on the couch, she rested her head on his shoulder. The television hummed softly in the background, but she wasn't watching. She was listening to his breathing, slow, steady, and thinking about all the years that had brought them here. There had been storms. There had been nights filled with silence sharp enough to cut. There had been wounds that never fully closed. But there had also been laughter, and forgiveness, and love, imperfect but enduring. She closed her eyes. In her mind, she saw the letter fluttering through the morning air again, the ink fading into sky, the words dissolving into light, and for the first time she felt no ache, no jealousy, no fear, just understanding. She understood that love wasn't a possession or a victory. It wasn't something you won, it was something you tended, and sometimes tending meant letting go of the past, so the present could breathe. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing softly against the window. He reached for her hand again, and she squeezed his gently, a small, wordless promise that even after all this time, she was still here. Not because everything was perfect, but because after everything, she still chose him. That was the quiet truth that came after the storm, the softness that followed. Morning light spilled through the curtains, gentle and golden. The house was still, except for the faint sound of birds outside, a sound she hadn't really heard in a long time. It wasn't that the birds had been gone. She just hadn't been listening. That was how healing began. Not with grand gestures, not with apologies shouted through tears, but with the soft rediscovery of sound, light, breath. She moved through the kitchen, her fingertips brushing the edge of the counter as though reacquainting herself with the space. There were small reminders of him everywhere. His reading glasses by the sink, the mug with a faint chip he refused to throw away. Each thing, once tinged with the ache of memory, now felt like proof of endurance. That evening, they stood together in the garden. He was holding a small sapling, its roots wrapped in burlap, soil damp and fragrant. "What kind is it?" She asked. "Jasmine," he said, glancing at her with a smile. "You used to love the smell." She did. She still did. The scent had always reminded her of beginnings, of youth and spring, and the first time he ever said her name like it mattered. They dug side by side, their hands in the earth. The air smelled of soil and forgiveness. When the hole was deep enough, they placed the sapling in. He held it steady while she filled the space around it, pressing the earth gently, tenderly, as if sealing a promise. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was full, meaningful, alive. As they finished, he wiped his hands on his jeans and looked at her. "Do you think it'll grow?" She smiled faintly. "If we take care of it." And she wasn't just talking about the jasmine. That night she went to the attic. The air was cool and dust-scented. The wooden floor creaked beneath her steps. There, on the old shelf, sat the box of letters, tied with ribbon, worn from years of hesitation. She lifted it gently, then set it inside an old trunk beside family albums, faded photographs, and mementos of their shared life. Not thrown away, not buried in shame, just resting. That's where the past belonged, not in the heart, not in the present, but in the quiet spaces that shaped who they had become. She closed the trunk softly and whispered, almost to herself, "It's enough now." Days turned into weeks, and life resumed its slow rhythm. Some mornings, She'd see him outside, watering the jasmine. He'd hum quietly to himself, and she'd watch from the window, a warmth growing inside her chest. The kind that comes from knowing you've survived something without letting it turn you bitter. One afternoon, he came in with a small white blossom in his palm. "It bloomed early," he said, eyes twinkling like they used to. She took it, smiling. "Maybe it's making up for lost time," he chuckled softly. "Aren't we all?" That evening they sat by the window where the story began. The candlelight flickered again, not as a reminder of what was lost, but as a quiet echo of what remained. The same table, the same two hands reaching across it. But something in the air had changed. Lighter, freer, softer. Forgiveness had taken root, not as a decision, but as a slow unfolding. It wasn't about forgetting what hurt. It was about remembering differently, without the sting. It was about looking at the same memories and seeing how far you've come, not just what you've lost. She looked at him, older now, gentler, still a little lost sometimes, and realized that love had never been about keeping each other perfect. It was about staying, again and again, through the imperfect parts. And maybe that was what forgiveness really was. Not erasing the past, but giving it a place to rest. That night, before she fell asleep, she glanced at him beside her, his breathing slow, his face softened by the glow of the bedside lamp. She reached over, brushed a strand of hair from his forehead and whispered, "We're okay." He stirred slightly, not waking, but a faint smile appeared on his lips, the kind that said he'd hurt her anyway. And for the first time in years, she slept soundly, not because everything was mended, but because her heart no longer ached to fix it. Sometimes peace isn't about answers. It's about knowing you've done enough to let love grow again. And outside, under the silver wash of moonlight, the jasmine tree stood quietly, its first blossoms open, its roots deep in forgiving soil. Years passed, and the world outside changed its colors. Seasons came and went, leaves fell, rains whispered on the roof, sunlight returned. But inside their home, everything had softened. Even silence had learned to breathe. She sat by the same window where so many of her thoughts had once broken open. The glass carried the reflection of an older woman now, lines around her eyes, a calm in her expression. There was something beautiful in the way time had left its trace, not as loss, but as proof of how much she had lived. The jasmine tree outside had grown taller. Its branches reached the window, each flower catching the morning light. Some days, she'd open the window just to let the scent drift in, a scent that once meant sorrow, but now meant peace. It amazed her how the same things could change meaning over time. The same song that once made her ache now made her smile. The same photo that used to burn with questions now felt like an old story told kindly by memory. She thought of that night, the candlelight, the trembling silence, the words they didn't know how to say. And for a moment, she almost pitied that version of herself, the one who thought love could only survive if it was flawless. But love was never meant to be flawless. It was meant to be felt, bruised, mended, reshaped. She had learned that forgiveness wasn't a moment. It was a quiet practice, a daily choice to look at what once hurt and see it differently, not as betrayal, not as weakness, but as proof of being human, of caring enough to be wounded and brave enough to stay. Sometimes in the evenings, they would sit together again, side by side, not saying much. The TV murmured faintly in the background. A clock ticked softly on the wall. He'd reach for her hand without looking, and she'd let him. There was no apology left to make, no confession left to give, only the gentle rhythm of two people who had finally stopped trying to be perfect for each other and simply started being present. She often thought about the word love, how it changes shape over time, how in the beginning it burns, bright, reckless, unstoppable, and later it becomes something quieter, a light that no longer dazzles but never goes out. There was comfort in that. The kind of comfort that comes from knowing you don't have to chase love anymore. You just have to tend to it, like a small tree, growing quietly in your own backyard. One morning, she found herself standing before that jasmine tree again, Its petals were falling, pale and soft against the grass. She bent down and picked one up. It smelled faintly of years, of laughter, of tears, of nights spent waiting for peace. She smiled. A real unhurried smile, because after everything, love hadn't left. It had simply become quiet again, not silent, just still. Still enough to hold everything it had once broken. And as the sun rose behind her, she whispered into the gentle air, "Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's remembering with less ache." Her voice barely carried, yet it lingered, like the last note of a song that refuses to fade. She turned from the window and walked back inside. Not as the woman who had once questioned if love could survive memory, but as someone who had finally learned how to live with both. The candlelight, the letters, the years of distance, they were all part of the same story. Not a story of betrayal or endurance, but of becoming. Because love, at its truest, was never about starting over. It was about staying long enough to see what could grow in the quiet that followed. And somewhere in that quiet, she found herself again, whole, unhurried, and finally at peace. You see, love doesn't always end with doors closing or hearts breaking. Sometimes it just changes its voice. It grows quieter, like the house after guests have gone home, or the sea after a storm. Still there, just softer. There was a time when she thought silence meant absence, when the spaces between words felt like distance. But years later she learned, silence can also mean safety. It can mean two people who no longer need to fill every pause to prove they care. It can mean peace. The candlelight that once trembled now feels steady. The letters she once feared to open have turned to rest. And the woman who once asked, "Why her?" now whispers, "It was never about her. It was about me." Learning to stay kind to the part of myself that still remembered. That's the thing about love. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it survives in the smallest gestures. A shared cup of tea. A hand found in the dark. A quiet morning where forgiveness sits between them like sunlight on the floor. Maybe that's what it means to grow old together. Not to hold on to what was perfect, but to keep choosing what's real. Because in the end, love doesn't ask for grand endings. It asks for presence. For someone to still be there when the noise fades. And when love finally became quiet again, she didn't feel loss. She felt grace. A soft, wordless grace that only time could teach. That forgiveness isn't the closing of a story. It's the gentle way a heart learns to keep beating after. Sometimes love doesn't leave. It just learns to be still.